Hey Joe, it's your old pal Jason. Just here to do your test suite review for RailsDevs.com. Let's dive right in here. So I have open several files here in my editor, and I'll go through these one by one and give some comments. So the first thing I want to share is that I think you did a good job with a lot of your descriptions of your tests. It's pretty clear what these tests are about. A lot of times I see test suites and the messages are either cryptic or just frankly not a lot of thought was put into what these say, and so it makes it hard to understand what the tests are about. But in your case, it's pretty easy to understand. So that's good. I'm looking at this one test. This is one of your bigger test files, I think. If I look at how many lines it is, it has 431 lines. This is kind of a common pattern that I see where here you have test integration developers test. If we look at the integration folder, we have like developers test, conversations test, messages test, referrals test. I assume that most of these are connected to an active record model. The pattern that I see a lot is a one-to-one relationship between an active record model and a test. And that can be fine in the early life of a project. But then as things grow, it becomes, well, what happens is these files grow and they get to the point where they're not very cohesive anymore. They're not about one single thing. So what I'm actually going to try to do here is I'm going to go through this developer's test and see how I can make how I can maybe logically break this up. So I'm just going to read a few of these things out loud just to understand them a little bit better maybe. Can view developer profiles. No developers produce empty state. Custom meta tags are rendered. Developers are sorted by newest first. Okay. I actually don't understand these very deeply, but that might be because of my lack of familiarity with the app. But these seem fairly miscellaneous. And so I might not do these first. My objective was to maybe move these into some separate files. But since these all four are like so different seeming from each other, I'm not going to start with those. I'm going to see if I can find a cohesive chunk. What I think I also want to do is one of the things I think it's good to do in both test files and application code is to highlight what's essential and hide the incidental details. And so if I'm looking at the developer's test, what I want to see first are the most relevant tests, the most there's certain tests that it probably would make sense to see first. And I would think like this test for can view developer profiles, maybe it makes sense. But this no developers produced empty state. But now that I think about that, maybe that's a good one too. But then custom meta tags are rendered. That feels kind of peripheral. That feels like not part of the essence of the concept of a developer. And so I'm going to try to identify the tests that are the most essential and move those toward the top, and take the tests that are more incidental and move those more toward the bottom, with the view toward maybe even moving those somewhere else entirely. Okay. And really, should this be developers test or maybe the developers area test, something like that? Let me see for a second. Okay, maybe I should go here. Okay, yeah. So I don't know if you have a term you use for this area. Maybe you call it the developer directory or something like that. And so maybe this could be the developer directory test. And in fact, I'm going to rename it to that, even though I know I might be wrong. I'm going to do developer directory test and call it that. Now, when I'm looking at any particular test, I can say, okay, is this closely related to the developer directory? If so, it belongs here. If not, maybe it belongs somewhere else. Okay, so far all this stuff does seem relevant. Developers are sorted by newest first. Developers can be sorted by their search score. Okay. Let me look at something. You know, maybe this thing deserves its own set of tests. I'm not sure, but maybe. Yeah, I think I would say so. So let's do this. Test integration. I'm going to call it developer filters. Let's copy this. Okay, and then I'll take any of these that are clearly filter related and move them there. I know sorting and filtering aren't exactly the same concept, so maybe I'll have to change that, but that's okay. I'm not worried about getting it exactly right the first pass. Okay. Developers with incorrect role type query does not raise an error. I don't know what a role type query is, but I'll not worry about that for now. Developers can be filtered by role level. Okay, more filtering stuff. And okay, so there we go. I think this is actually a filter related thing too. Paginating filter developer. Yeah, okay. And now this filtering test is actually getting kind of big itself. Page 2 of search result. Oh wait, pagination only appears for subscribed businesses. Okay, I feel like that doesn't belong in the filter tests. Page 2 of search results only renders for subscribers. I feel like that's maybe more permissions related than filter related. Okay, I feel like maybe we're past the filter related tests now. But I'm going to keep going just to be more sure. Okay. So that was my first chunk I moved out. I moved out these filter tests. And again, maybe I didn't pick the right label because we have both filtering and searching in here. Maybe it's even warranted to have a filter test file and a search test file. I'm going to reserve judgment about that. But what I'm going to do now is just continue to mess with this. And by the way, these are all scratch changes. I wouldn't actually work in this way and like commit this. This isn't my normal workflow. I'm just pushing around code as an illustration. Okay. So I see this thing about incorrect role type query. Again, I don't know what that means yet. Pagination only appears for subscribed businesses. Page 2 of search results only renders for subscribers. Those two tests obviously seem permissions related. Just making mental notes for now. Cannot create new profile if already has one. Okay, that's now a different concern. It's no longer role permission related. Okay, these three all have something to do with profiles. So I'm going to create a new test. I call it developer profile test. Okay, I'll copy this. Oops. Okay. Yeah, all three of these at least seem quite profile related. Actually, I'm going to take back what I said. I'm going to call this developer profile creation test. I'm going to rename this file, even though this is all just Scratch. Okay, and then I'll create another one called developer profile edit test. So it should actually be consistent, and I should call this developer profile create test. Actually, I'll call it create developer profile test. And this other one I'll call edit developer profile test. Okay, and I'm going to rename this file again now that I've changed the name again. Create developer profile test. Create developer profile test. Okay. I'll copy this, put it here. Edit developer profile test, and I'll move this edit test to there. Hang on a second. Redirect to the edit profile when they try to enter developers new if they already have a profile. That's actually more of a creation related thing. Okay, never mind about that. Okay, cannot create new profile, blah, blah, blah. Obviously creation related, creation related. Okay, is there anything else? Oh, look, a typo. Developer. I'm looking for more creation tests. Successful edit to profile. Okay. Oh, edit with nested attributes. There we go. So my creation of that file was not in vain. Okay. And then we have redirect to the edit profile. Have we not already? Oh, what am I doing? Okay, I confused myself for a second. Invalid profile creation. Okay, that of course goes in the create developer profile test. Can edit own profile, that goes in the edit test. Okay. Cannot edit another developer's profile, I think that goes in the edit test. Developer bios, okay, that's not all that closely related to these tests. Okay. Okay, so just to quickly review what we've done. This file started off as like 431 lines, now it's only 204. We moved some of these tests into a developer filters test, some into an edit developer profile test, and some into a create developer profile test. So I feel pretty good about that. Now, what do we have left? I mentioned that I wanted to try to put the most essential tests first and the incidental tests later. And I think we do have the most essential tests first, perhaps. So good job on that. But the less essential tests, I think, start here. Custom meta tags are rendered. I'm going to move up. Developers are sorted by newest first. Create with nested attributes. I guess I missed this one. This should go in create. Okay, meta tags. Oh yeah, that's the one I just moved. Can't view developer with invisible profile. Okay, I see 3 tests here that seem to have to do with viewing. So view developer profile test, I'm gonna call it that. Whoops. Okay, can't view developer with invisible profile. Can see own developer profile when invisible. Admin can see invisible developer profile. Developer hidden profile information is rendered with public profile key. Okay, all these I think go in the view test. Whoops. Okay. Developers are found via hash ID. Developer path. That seems to be the profile page, making this apparently a profile test. Same with, I guess, these. Okay. This is interesting. We have these assert text, and refute text methods defined in this class. Okay, so this isn't a testing thing. This is just a general coding thing. I think we head down a dangerous path when we start doing things like this, where assert text. Well, hang on. Let me make sure I'm saying something that's true. Okay, so assert text seems to be used in these 2 places, and then once in this other test. So back when this developer test was like pretty big, it was 431 lines, we're using assert text in just 3 places, but we're defining this assert text method. So it's like we're making this whole file pay the cost of having this method here when it's only used in a couple places. It's like not fair to this class that it has to pay for that method. And what I mean by that is, like, when you look at this class, this method lives here, even though it's not really a part of the essence of this class. There's only like those couple places that use it. And so I would be inclined to do one of 2 things. Sometimes that's a sign that like this method is cohesive with the place that it's used. But in this case, assert text, that seems very broad. And so maybe that should go in a helper. But also in this case, like, what if we just duplicate it instead? How did I manage to do that? Okay. Okay, so that would be assert select text. Yeah, sorry, just assert text. So the text in this case would be that. And then where do we have? Yeah, we have assert text here also. Assert select text. Like, that's not very duplicative. And then just for completeness, we can go here. There we go. Like, that's really not very duplicative. In fact, yeah, it's not very duplicative. Let me say this. Let me talk about something with regard to duplication. Duplication took me a long time to arrive at this definition. Duplication is when there are two behaviors or more expressed in let me start over. It's when there's a single behavior that's expressed in two or more places in the code. And that's a little bit different between application code and test code. Application code has to meet specifications, whereas test code itself is a specification. The test code is always correct. Like, by definition of the fact that it exists, it's correct. Because the correctness of the application code is determined by whether it meets the specifications of the tests or not. But the tests are totally arbitrary. You're just specifying what you want. And the correctness of the tests is only determined by whether you decide they're correct. And so as long as the tests match what you decided, they're always correct. So again, application code meets specifications, whereas tests are specifications. And so whereas behaviors can be duplicated in application code, with test code, the thing that's being duplicated is usually not a behavior. Like these two assertion lines, it's not really a behavior, and it doesn't logically follow that if one changes, the other should change too. Because that's another key thing about duplication. Like, if one piece of code changes and then it's a logical necessity that the other piece of code has to change too, then that's definitely duplication. If two pieces of code happen to be identical, but it doesn't logically follow that just because one changes means the other should change, then that's not actually duplication. Because it's not exactly that it's duplication of the code, it's that it's duplication of the behavior. So all that's to say that I'm not sure this is real duplication. And so I don't think it costs very much to have these things duplicated that way. I think it actually costs more, arguably, to have that assert text method that we now have to care for. So I'd rather delete that and live with this duplication instead, which again is, if it's duplication at all, it's certainly not a very severe instance. Okay, so that's that monologue. Let's see what we want to focus on next. I'm going to continue reviewing the tests in this file. Custom developer meta tags are rendered. Don't really understand. Invalid form changes label color. This is interesting. Okay, so I'll say this like this. A lot of these tests so far are pretty high level. We're asserting that there's something on the page. We're creating an oldest and newest developer. Then we're visiting a page, asserting these two things are there. Asserting for this text on the page. Pretty high level. But then we go down to here, and this is pretty low level. So we're kind of mixing levels of abstraction. And when we mix levels of abstraction, it makes things hard to understand. It makes things a little bit jarring. It's easier to understand a file if everything's at the same level of abstraction. So I'm going to try to understand this test a little bit better. Invalid form changes label color. I'm guessing that means when you submit the form, some things turn red, something like that. And I can understand what's happening. There's an empty form being submitted apparently. Or no, somebody signing in. Then we make a post request to we make an empty post request rather. And then we're asserting that the resulting page contains these red labels. Let me think. Maybe that's the least worst version of that test. I'm not sure. I don't have a super strong opinion of that, so I'm going to leave that alone. In any case, it's not a very big test. So I think the cost of understanding this is pretty low. It's a pretty simple test. As we demonstrated, I could understand it in like less than 1 minute just now. So I think this is fine. I had a suspicion about this test, but upon a closer look, my suspicion has been allayed. So that's okay. Refute text. I'm sure that's the same exact story there. I'd probably rather have the duplication. I'm not even going to worry about what this is. It seems like maybe a small can of worms, but a can of worms I don't even want to open at this moment. Okay, so I'm going to leave these other developer tests open for a minute. Oh, and I'm sorry. Let me look. Integration, developer test. How big did this end up? I'm just curious. A little over 100 lines. So we whittled this down to like a quarter of its original size. Okay, now here's a model test. And people have a tendency to make the same mistake with model tests as they do with integration tests. Or if you want to use the word mistake, it's a deviation from my personal preferences, my personal views of what's good. But anyway, the mistake I see in integration tests is we have, for example, that one file that says developer test, and then everything that could possibly have something to do with a developer is in that file. But I think it's much easier to understand if we have all the tests that have something to do with viewing a developer grouped together, everything that has to do with creating a developer profile together, they're grouped in that way. I think that's much easier to understand. So I think this developer model test is kind of suffering from a similar issue. And I think we maybe only have time for probably this file, so I'm going to close all my other tabs so they don't distract me anyway. About 200 lines of tests, okay. And I'm going to go to the developer model here. And I'm going to do a similar thing here. So again, we want to highlight what's essential and hide what's incidental. The first test is obfuscated profile URLs. To me, that seems relatively incidental, relatively peripheral. So I probably wouldn't put that test first. In fact, I'm going to put this test last. Okay, is valid. That seems pretty essential. Invalid without user. Also, okay, we have a bunch of validation tests here. That's fine. I think there's an argument to be made that validation tests are tautological, but I don't have a super strong opinion about that, so I'm going to leave that matter alone. Should accept avatars of valid file formats. So we have at least a couple tests that are similar here. Should reject avatars of invalid file formats. Okay, so this is a case where I might consider putting these in their own separate test file. Avatars. Let's see what we have that has to do with avatars. I don't see avatarable. Interesting. Avatarable. Okay. And I'm just curious how many things use avatarable. Developer and business. Interesting. Okay. Okay, should accept avatars of valid file formats. So, well, I think here's what I'd probably at least do. I would go to test models, developer, avatar. But we have this cover image thing too. I might say something like this. I'm not sure that I'm going to get this right on the first try, but I might say something like developer attachments test, something like that. And then I'll move all these to there. And again, I'm not claiming that these tests would run as I've written them now. This is just an illustration. Okay, so we moved out these developer attachment related tests, and it's actually kind of a lot of them. So I feel like this is justified and beneficial to move these to a separate file. Okay. Normalizes social media profile input. Okay. When updating a profile doesn't require search status. A lot of these feel miscellaneous, which is neither, I'm making no judgment about that right now. Missing fields when search status is blank. Okay. So missing fields goes from false to true. Okay. Search status. I think there's a slightly more understandable way this could be expressed. I don't know what search status is. I'm just going to put something there. But my opinion is that this is more clear when expressed this way. When this is happening, I at first mistake this for a sequence of events. But here it's clearer that it's not a sequence of events. We're just setting a value and then making an assertion, and same thing here. I'm curious, by the way, what that missing fields method is. Okay. Yeah, that seems like a good test to have. What bugs me a little bit about Minitest versus RSpec is you don't have that nesting ability. And so even though this is clearly a group of methods that relate to this missing fields method, a group of tests that relate to this missing fields method, we have no way to group these tests inside of this file. We have to move it to a separate file, or we would have to install the, Minitest spec gem, which I'm actually not a big fan of because one, it's like a janky reverse engineer of RSpec and doesn't have identical behavior, and that can result in weirdnesses sometimes. And the other reason is like, wait, do you pick Minitest or do you pick RSpec? Like, pick one. Don't use Minitest and then try to use RSpec syntax with it. Like, either use one or the other. But what I might be inclined to do, as crazy as it might sound, test models, developer missing fields test.rb. I'm not saying I would necessarily do this, but I would certainly at least consider it. Okay, developer missing fields test. There we go. There are enough tests here that maybe feels justified. And then that big chunk is no longer in here. Okay, so we're a bit past the half-hour mark. Joe, thanks for inviting me to do this, and especially thanks for letting me put this up publicly and air your dirty laundry. I hope you got some value out of this, and I will talk to you later.